some housekeeping rules. We encourage you to please keep your microphones muted so that the session is clear and so that we move on with a good pace. Eric, you are welcome to take the floor. I will be moving your slides, so please let me know when to move to the next slide. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me to this seminar. That's really a pleasure. My name is Eric Schulte Nordholt. Just call me Eric, that's much easier because my family name is very long and difficult to pronounce, so Eric is much shorter, much easier. I'm working for Statistics Netherlands, a small country in northwestern Europe. And in this office, I'm responsible for the census, the population and housing census. And I'll try to tell you a bit about it, why we have such a register-based census, how we moved from a more traditional approach in the past towards an approach we have at the moment. Gloria, could you show the slide with the outline to everybody? Yes. So normally I give lectures of many hours and even full days and a couple of days. Well, that's not what's going to happen now. I will just give you a short introduction into the things we are doing. So I could tell a little bit more about the data collection we have, because we have changed our office, because not only our census but many statistics are based on the registers, on the administrative data that we have. We have what we call an input division, one of the divisions of our office, and that the input division is responsible for getting all the survey data and all the register data. So they make the data available for the other divisions of our office, including the division of social statistics where I work, because the population and housing census is based in this division of socioeconomic and spatial statistics, as we officially have named it. I could tell you also a little bit more about the history later on, and of course we publish our results. There are lots of variables included in our census, as probably also in your censuses. It's quite an impressive list of variables that we collect. I can also tell you a little bit more about the characteristics of our census. And people often ask me, well, if you want to change the census methodology, what are the requirements? What are the conditions when you want to change, when you want to have a successful change? Although our office exists for 2 centuries now, so that's yeah, it's quite a time. The censuses are even older than that, and we are able to compare all the census results over time. We often also compare with other countries, because it's very interesting to compare our results with results of other countries. And of course, I would also like to have the opportunity in the future to compare our results with the results in the countries that you are representing. I think that's very interesting, both the approach, the methods, the results, what's going on. We often compare with the other countries in what we call the UN Economic Commission for Europe region. That's not only the European Union countries, it's all countries in the European continent, but also Canada, the United States, and also all the former Soviet republics are included. So that's a region of 56 countries, and we often compare our approaches and our results. We have a census every 10 years, but we have, of course, many other publications in the years between. But we also have what we call a number of yearly census updates, because we think that once every 10 years, well, that was nice in the past, but now we think it's good to have more actual information. So we update the main tables every year, and every 10 years we have a full census again. So that's our approach. Maybe we can go to the next slide on the data collection. Let's see if I have. Yeah. So we have what we call a centralized data collection, as I mentioned, to be more efficient and more professional, where we use the same infrastructure for social and economic statistics as much as possible. And nowadays we try to get everything we need for our publications from registers. If that's not feasible, if they're not available or not of good quality, then we conduct sample surveys to get the additional information. And for our population and housing censuses, nowadays we only use existing sources. So we rely mainly on registers, but we have a few variables that are not in registers available. And those variables we get from existing surveys. And nowadays that's only the label for a survey that we use for one variable, the variable occupation, because we have no occupation register. So for the variable occupation, we use microdata of the label for a survey again and estimate those tables. So it means that for recent censuses, like the 2001 and 2011 censuses, for which I was responsible, there are no questionnaires. Most variables are from registers and the others are estimated from already existing surveys. Well, that's our general approach. In the meantime, if you have any question, you're always welcome to ask me. So if there are any specific questions, you can always interrupt me. That's always fine. Otherwise, I can just continue with the next slide on the data. The next slide.
Yes, excuse me. Hi, this is Mike from SPC. I just have a question whether you have an example of a time when the registers did not meet your data needs and you had to do some primary data collection. Do you have any example?
Yeah, we used to have the census data collection with census questionnaires till 1971. So that was the last time we had really a census questionnaire. But for example, we used to have problems with the variable level of education attained. It's very important to know about the level of education that the people in your country have. But the information in the education register was not of good enough quality. Many people were not yet in that register. So then we said, well, if it's incomplete, we cannot use it. It's also selective what we missed. For example, people may have reached a higher level of education by education abroad. For example, immigrants or people went abroad for a further degree. So we say, well, this register is not of good enough quality. We will use information from a survey where we have asked the people. So that's what we did in 2011. In the meantime, we've been working hard on improving this education register. And now for the next census, which will be a 2021 census in my country, we will for the first time use also the education register. So there was no big bang. It was a gradual process that more and more variables were no longer coming from surveys, but coming from registers. Just as an example, I hope that illustrates the process we went through. When we look at the data and we look back in our last census, we had lots of registers, but the key register was the population register. We have an automated population registration system, so all people have to register in the municipality where they live. And that is the key aspect. That's the basic set of variables. Then we need information about the jobs. We have a register on all the jobs. We have a register on people who are self-employed. We have information on the fiscal administration, on the social security administration. We also have information on the pensions and life insurance benefits that people may have. And as it's a population and housing register, we also use the population and housing census. We also use the housing register for all the housing variables. In the past, we also used several surveys. Nowadays, we only use information from our labor force survey as an additional source. If we look at the history, that's slide number 5. You see that since the slide number, the next one, please. Yeah. You see lots of different years.
Excuse me. Are you continuing on the presentation, or are you still answering that question from SPC?
I'm now continuing with my presentation. Yes.
Oh,
is that okay?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I wanted to ask a few short questions. This is Bonifacio. Yeah, this is Bonifacio Massa from Samoa, the civil registrar, newly appointed registrar, and I thank for this presentation, or even though that we have not reached the end. But I just wanted to ask if you can kindly brief the role of that input division, because you mentioned that you have an input division that mainly focus on getting the data from registrars to assist with the population register. So I'm just wondering if you can briefly touch base on the roles of that division, because we have this is a very good initiative for the Pacific Islands, and I beg you to bear with us, because you have advanced more than us, and we wanted to learn from you. So the first question is to briefly explain the role of that division, input division, and the second one is the data. When you mentioned the data collection, the population relies heavily on registered and existing data, and some of the variables, the missing variables, are you getting from the existing surveys, and then you've mentioned the labor force survey. Can you also briefly explain on that, please?
Sorry, Eric, you're muted. Please unmute yourself.
You're muted.
Sorry. So to answer the first question, we have lots of different sources, and these sources are used by different statistics. Before, all the statistics had their own input, but we share the input. So this input division is very experienced in running the surveys and getting the registers in the right format and make them available for the other divisions, like the social statistics and the economic statistics division. So they are working on getting the data we need, and when the data are readable, available, complete, we get access to the data to make the statistics in the different divisions and the different units. So that's a change that we made a number of years ago. And that also means that the different units are very dependent on each other. It's a joint effort. The input division is getting the data. We produce all the tables, all the publications, and the output division is helping us to run the press releases, make the publications available to the general public and to international organizations. So that's the model we have adopted. So we are, as a division, producing statistics in the middle, between the input division and the output division that assist us in our work. Information is coming from the different registers that I mentioned, and there we find the variables, or we can derive the variables. For example, we have the date of birth of all our inhabitants, and then we simply calculate what is their age on census day. So we make a simple calculation. And so we have lots of derivations, and we do lots of checks to have consistent information. But we heavily rely on the registers that are made available for us by other government authorities. They have the role to maintain those registers and to take care that all the people are indeed included and that their information is updated regularly. And this has not always been the case. In the old days, in the 19th century and most censuses in last century, we collected all the data with a questionnaire. But then we realized this is an expensive exercise, getting all the questionnaires, all the editing, the checking. That's very expensive. You may also have the situation that some people are not filling in the questionnaire or are not filling in the questionnaire completely. So even with questionnaires, there's no guarantee that all the information is complete and correct. So the people in my country have to register and they have to update their information. It's in their own interest. People do want to be registered because the registers are used for so many different purposes, one of them being statistics. So that gives you an idea. If we could go to the slide with the virtual censuses, you see 1981 till 2011. And those are the years that we have had what we call virtual censuses. Until 1971, we had what we call traditional censuses with questionnaires. And since then, we have virtual censuses based on the population register and completed with surveys. However, we were not so satisfied with the first two virtual censuses because we missed regional information, we missed a number of variables. But what I've seen with my own eyes when I started working in 1992 in the office is that we were still working with surveys for all the statistics. And in the 90s of last century, we have gradually introduced the registers in all the statistics. And when I was asked to run the 2001 census, we set up a system. It's called the System of Social Statistical Datasets, abbreviated as SSD. And there we put all the information we need for our census, all the different sources, all the different variables together. And we are allowed to link all these data on unique identifiers. All people in our country have a unique number, and these numbers appear in these sources. And based on these numbers, we can link them without errors. That has not always been the case, but introducing a unique number is a big advantage. Then you know exactly that every person appears one time in these statistics. I've also been discussing with the colleagues in Japan, and 2 years ago they have introduced such a number as a first step for Japan to move from a traditional census towards a register-based census, so that their population register will be the backbone of their census. It doesn't mean that they will immediately drop the census questionnaire because there are so many other variables that they need to ask to the people. But it's a first step. And this is a first step that many countries make. Say, well, we have some register, or we want to set up a register. Now that we have it, can we make it available to official statistics? And can we use it for our census? And then if you have that, you can gradually add other sources to this backbone. And this is how many countries work. And yeah, in Europe, there's also what we call a European Census Act. And that is stipulating some minimum standards. So what should you have at least in your census? Because all countries have different variables in their censuses, but there's kind of minimum set that is easy to compare. And we have also a joint publication where you can find all our tables that are produced in such a way that you can easily compare it with other countries. Well, here you see some background information on the publication. There's also some information on the variables, but I'm not going into all the details here. I would like to show you some characteristics of the Dutch census. It's the next slide, please. Next. Yes, here it is. So our census is relatively cheap because we don't have to ask all the people. And that makes a big difference. The production time we need is relatively short. And we also think it's more socially acceptable than the old censuses, where people were not always willing to fill in all the detail we asked them. All the tables we produce are numerically consistent, so it's a consistent set of tables, just like in the traditional censuses. Of course, in the survey part, there is some missing information, but we accept that. But that's a very small part. It's only one variable now. We have become very dependent on the registers, so we often talk to the people in the registers. So when will we get the data? Is there any news? Is there any change? That's important for us to know. Our data are comparable over time. We have also nice graphs also included in the set of slides that I provided you, showing variables over time. We're also international comparable with our results, so that the results of our census can be compared with other countries' censuses. And we make our data continuously available. We update the key tables every year. On the next slide, you see the conditions. Well, you need to have a legal base. I think that's valid for all countries. For us, that's the Statistics Act. We have one Statistics Act for all our statistics. You also need public approval. You don't want people telling, oh, Big Brother is watching you. People say, well, I'm a citizen of the country, I'm registered so that my children can go to school. In case I'm ill, I can go to hospital. So we have all that information. There's a lot of cooperation among the different government organizations that maintain all the registers. And we have a comprehensive and reliable register system. That has not always been like that. This was built up over time based on old census information and asking all the people to update their records. And it's also very helpful to have a unique identifier so that you can easily link the data. I don't say it's not possible without that, but it makes life for a statistician much easier if you have a unique number. Then you can easily find the different variables for the same person in the different registers and link them. This shows you some comparisons over time where the population went up in those 2 centuries from 2 million to over 17 million, but the number of people per household gradually went down, especially after the Second World War. People got fewer and fewer children. Children moved out at earlier ages, but also people are growing older and older. And then in old ages, people also often live on their own. So the number of people per household is now only 2 on average. So that's an interesting comparison. And finally, I would like to show you a map of the UNECE region. And this shows Europe, former Soviet republics, Canada and the United States. And we went through all these countries in a big UN project that I was leading. And we asked them, what kind of census do you have? Well, most countries in Europe have a traditional census with census questionnaires. But that could be with paper questionnaires, electronic questionnaires. It could be with mail back the information. There are lots of different innovations there. But there are some countries that use registers. These are the orange countries. like Germany and Spain and Turkey, are countries that used registers so that they didn't have to ask everything to everybody. They vary in how much information they use, but they saved a lot of money because they didn't have to ask all the questions to all the people in their countries. And then there's a group of 9 countries. They are kind of pink in this map. The 5 Nordic countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria and Slovenia. And those countries have no census questionnaires any longer. It means that they collect all the census variables from the registers available or estimate, but they have no census questionnaires left. So they save a lot of money, and they have comparable approaches. Some of these countries estimate the variable from the labor force survey. Others don't do that, but further the results are very comparable. Although in size, with Norway, Sweden and Finland in the north, it looks impressive. But in terms of population, most of these countries have relatively small populations. And the Netherlands is the biggest one. Well, certainly not in size, because we are only a small country in size. But in population, with nowadays almost 17.5 million people, we are the biggest register-based census country. And what we see is that gradually countries move towards more registers or completely register-based. Some countries say, well, we don't want that. We still want to ask everything to everybody, or maybe a sample of the people in the next round. That's country specific. But it's very interesting to learn from each other. And I also hope that you learned a bit from what I told you. But if you have any questions, just let me know, because I can imagine that this is not very common for you. So if anything was unclear, or if you have any other question, just ask me.
Eric, as Ian here, there are some questions in the chat which we might ask you in a moment. One question I wanted to ask, because it came up at one of the previous webinars, was about how do you think about quality in a registered-based censuses as compared to a traditional census? Because you probably have to think about it differently.
Yeah, that's a good point, because quality matters. It's important to have good quality data that are trustworthy, that can be used by politicians in their debates, that can be used for policy purposes, that are understandable for the people. An advantage that I see of a register-based census is that the linkage with unique numbers is going easily. As you know directly if you have the information of everybody. So the completeness is better with a register-based census than in the traditional approach we had before. Another aspect is what's the quality of the registers you use? Because if the registers you use are not of good quality, your census will not be of good quality. So we have been hesitating now and then, well, can we use this register? Is this register good enough, or should we still ask this or this variable? Therefore, we changed the Statistics Act so that the other government authorities have to give us their microdata that are relevant for the census. So that's mandatory for them. But additionally, we have lots of contacts with the register owners so that we tell them how important they are for us. We are also willing to help them if there are any issues. And we have lots of debates at different levels. We have at the top management level yearly meetings. At the lower management levels, we have more frequent meetings, and we have also at the work floor lots of questions that can be asked to the register owners via account managers. They nowadays play an important role to collect all the questions and ask them to those organizations. So nothing is perfect. A census is good, is often very good, but it's not perfect. You may miss information, you may have the wrong information. But when I speak for my own country, the quality we have now, we couldn't reach with a traditional approach because so many people are not participating or are not giving answers or the correct answers to all the questions. So it's not perfect, but the quality we have now is better than what we had in the past. That may not be the case in all countries of the world. I mean, you cannot generalize that, but that's the situation in my country. And I know this is also the situation in the other register-based census countries. We have a lot of contact with this group of 9 countries. We email and visit each other quite often. We know what's going on in these 9 countries. And we are all certain that in our countries this is the situation. But I also know...
Sorry, yes. Can I just ask, there are a couple of other questions that people have...
Yeah.
That was excellent. So can we just ask some of the other questions that people... Elizabeth has asked, what are the techniques used in deriving the estimates from the existing surveys?
Yeah.
So the LFS, etc. How do you use that data to derive estimates?
Yeah, for example, what we do for the occupation variable, which is still a survey variable, we collect all the labor force survey records around census day, and we say, well, who do we have? For which person do we have this information? It's a continuous survey, so we collect in a period around census day, and then we have a few 100,000 people where we have occupation information available. And all these records have a weight variable because it's a survey. And we use that weight as an initial weight. And then we weight those records that are having relevant information on the occupation variable to the population totals. So we have a starting weight and we have a final weight, so that we use as much information from the survey, not only the variable but also the weight that we have, and then we make them consistent to the population total. So that's a process. So we have a very extended weighting model to make the tables consistent. So that's the approach we have. So in my team, I always have a few weighting experts to do that work.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Jakob Zivoldi, if I've pronounced his name correctly. What was the non-response rate in 1971 that made the decision to abandon face-to-face population censuses?
Yeah, the non-response rate was about 2%. About 2% of the population didn't want to answer or couldn't answer the census questionnaires. Well, nowadays, a response rate of 98% would be great. But in 1971, it was a shock that we missed 2%, because people said, well, this is a selective group. Because in our capital, in Amsterdam, we missed 10%, whereas in the countryside, we had almost everybody. So it was 2%, but it was very selective. Lots of students didn't want to join. And this was much more than ever before, where there was only minor non-response. And the government said, well, it's not nice, but we're not going to give fines to so many people. If you want to give fines to 2% of your population, that is still an impressive number of people you're going to fine. So they said, well, we're not going to do that. But then you can't say it's mandatory if you don't give a fine. And then they said, well, we should stop with this way of conducting a census. We are very interested in the results. We need them, we want them, but we have to find another methodology. So after the 1971 census, we had to look for an alternative, and that became what we call the virtual censuses.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric. I think that was a very well done presentation, very comprehensive, very interesting, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of follow-up questions even after the webinar. I just want to pick up on some of your remarks, which will lead us on to the next presentation, where you said that you have been having meetings, regular conversations with register owners to ensure that that dialogue is happening, that data sharing is happening, which leads us very well into our next presentation with Philippe from Paris 21, who will be speaking to us about national strategies for the development of statistics and why we should care about them, particularly if we want to strengthen the use of registers and administrative data in our countries. Philippe is the regional program coordinator of the African region in Paris 21, and he also leads the statistical capacity development team at Paris 21. Philippe, are you there? Can you hear me? Philippe, can you hear me? Philippe, can you hear me? Is it there? Okay. If Philippe is not ready, I think we'll just flow into our next presenter, who is Ian Cope. And Ian will provide us with a synthesis of the of the lessons that we learn from countries that are using register-based approaches for their censuses. And Ian is a former staff of the UK National Statistics Office, where we worked for nearly 30 years, and he was responsible for the operational aspects of the 2011 census in England and Wales until 2018. So Ian, you are welcome to take the floor. I'll just flow into your slides.
Let me take control, Gloria.
Okay, great. Just to do that.
Will you try and contact Felipe offline? Thinking. Oops, gone too far, sorry. Okay, good morning everybody, Ian Cope here again. So yeah, I'm going to cover some of the, well, in some of the later presentations we're going to hear about the particular methods used in register-based countries. We all just heard from Eric about the Netherlands approach. When you look at the approaches taken in these countries, there are kind of common themes and common approaches. So this presentation tries to pull out those themes, the key insights, the lessons learned from the countries who have used registers and admin data. And we'll pick up on some of these messages in later webinars, but I thought it would be helpful to summarise them early on so that you have them in the back of your mind and can look at in future. And Eric's given us some of this information already. So in the 2010 round, the countries that used full registers were the Nordic countries, Austria, Belgium, etc. As Eric also told us, a number of other countries had a mixture of registers and sample surveys, or a mixture of registers and traditional censuses. I'll skip on with this quickly. So the rest of this presentation is mostly going to focus on the register-based countries. So what's really important if you're thinking of moving in this direction is having a framework for the register and combined censuses. You know, how you actually make this happen. So look on this diagram, you've got the data sources on the left-hand side. So that will be from registers, other administrative data that might not be in registers, census data, survey data, existing or new one, and potentially also other data sources like big data, etc. Although that's not used in practice that often. That has to then be transformed, and you have to link those registered data together. And I'm going to talk about linking in a moment in the next slide or so. So once you've linked the data together, you take the data from the administrative registers and produce some statistical registers. And the key registers are registers of people, a population register, address register, business register, and then a series of activity registers that might be on employment and education and ethnicity, etc., etc. And so from those suite of registers, you can then produce outputs in the kind of traditional way. And underpinning all of this is measuring quality and quality assurance. So you have to think about the quality assuring the input data, the registers, etc., quality assuring the linking process, particularly thinking about under and over coverage, quality assuring the registers themselves, and then obviously also quality assuring the outputs. And you might do that by comparing the results from your registers and administrative data against traditional sources, so comparing back to a census, for instance. And that's something that the Office for National Statistics is doing at the moment. As Eric identified, a key enabler for using register-based data is having a unique identification system or a common identifier across the different register sources. So those countries with register-based censuses, they're fully register-based censuses, all those countries have a person ID system and a national population register. And then the same person ID is used consistently across those registers. And as Eric was saying earlier, that makes linkage of the data much easier. And these countries also have unique identifiers for other registers, so register of vehicles, register of buildings and businesses, etc., which makes linkage easier. Now, in countries where you don't have a national identification system and unique ID used across the registers, it's still possible to link, but it's harder. So although countries such as the UK and New Zealand don't have national ID cards, they have linked successfully by using a range of identifiers such as name, date of birth, address, etc. This is a much more complex process and it's less certain, so there's probably more error involved than when you have a unique ID that you can link on. But those countries have proven that it is possible to get accurate results, particularly for population, without a national ID scheme. So linkage is really important. How are you actually going to join all these data sets together? And there are a couple of models for doing so. The easiest perhaps, but not recommended, is to kind of pull all the data together into a single database with the identifying information, name, date of birth, etc., the ID numbers, as well as the characteristic information, all into a single database. Now, I'm only aware of one country that was doing that, which was Italy, but it's not a recommended approach because obviously it creates privacy and security risks. So the most common approach is a trusted third-party linkage model or variation on this. So as the name suggests, you have a trusted third party that might be outside of the stats office, and that's the case in Austria. The trusted third party in Austria is their Information Commission's office, their Privacy Commission's office, or you can have a separate team within the Statistics Office, within the NSO, and that's how a number of countries do this. So the trusted third party is just responsible for linking the identifiable data together. So the ID number from one source against another one, or the linking on name, date of birth, address, etc. between the registers. And then they create a new identifier, a statistical identifier. And then using that, that's passed back to the base register, and the attribute data can then be extracted from the source register and linked. And the advantage of this model is that the team that's responsible for the linkage only sees the identifier data and doesn't see the characteristics data, the information on employment or education or ethnicity, etc. They only have the identifiers. And the team that are doing the data analysis, they have the linked variables data, but not the identifiers. So in that data set that's used for analysis and producing results, the identification identifiers are not there, and that is a big step forward in preserving the confidentiality of the privacy of the data. And that's why it's the model that's used most commonly. There are Nordic countries have the kind of concept of a base register, which will be the administrative register, and then a statistical register, which is a statistical version of that. So The key administrative-based registers, as we've said before, a registration on Register of Persons, Population Register, and a strong foundation source for that is potentially the civil registration system. If you have very high coverage in your civil registration system, so that you're registering all births and all deaths, you can use that information, adjust then from inward and outward migration to form the basis of a population register, a statistical population register. Then there's an address register which identifies buildings, dwellings, factories, businesses, etc., and a business register. And then there will be associated statistical registers that go with these administrative-based registers.
Ian, I think you've not moved your slides yet because we cannot see the slides on the registers.
Well, I'm on key register. I can see it. I'm on slide 34. Can you see slide 34?
Yes, now we can see it.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you for letting me know that, Gloria. So the first part of that slide just covers what I've just said. Address is really important. It's the link between people and the dwellings in which they live, and it's the link between people and their places of work, their businesses as well. So the address is really important. And then other census variables can come from registers on health, jobs, education, tax, wages and salaries, etc., etc. But those are not base registers. In the Nordic countries, almost all of the registers, the base registers and the other registers have relevant identifiers, so that linking is normally quite straightforward. I've got two more substantive slides here and then a conclusion. Can you see this step-by-step development slide? Does that come up, Gloria?
Yes.
Yes.
Super, thank you. So when you actually look at the process that countries have used, the fully registered based censuses and the other countries, even the work that New Zealand, Canada and the UK are doing, they've all actually followed a very similar process. And this is almost like a step-by-step guide. If you're starting to make more use of registers and administrative data, these are the kind of steps that you need to think about and take account of. So the first one is make sure you have legislation in place to allow for sharing of registers and admin data with the NSO. Now that might be in a modern Statistics Act, which gives the NSO the right of access to such data, as Eric was saying they have in the Netherlands and the UK has now. Or it might be in individual pieces of legislation that govern the individual registers, and you might have to have memorandums of understanding in place. Ensure that there's public trust and support for the use of registers and admin data. And Eric emphasised that point as well. Even if you have legislation in place which gives you the right of access to the data, it's really important to build positive relationships with the register owners so that they understand how you're using the data. They alert you to any changes in the administrative systems that might impact on the data, and also that you understand their constraints as well, the constraints within which they're working. And you know, the stuff that Eric was telling us about how the Netherlands do that in practice was quite interesting. You need to develop a linkage model, as I've talked about earlier. If you don't already have one, you'll need to produce an address register. And that needs to align to the concept of household in the census. So the addresses need to be physical dwellings, etc., not post office boxes where just mail is delivered. The countries that have moved to a fully registered-based system have actually often changed their concept of what a household is to be something that's sensible on a register-based system. So that you have to think about the concept of household. If you don't have a national ID register and therefore can produce a statistical population register, statistical population register, New Zealand and the UK later about how they've approached this. And once you have a statistical population register, you can start to produce regular population estimates for local areas, and you can do that quite frequently annually. So that's a kind of levels-based approach rather than the cohort approach from updating the census with births and deaths, etc. And this is something that the UK is exploring at the moment. Then the different subject matter statistics, as Eric was outlining in the Netherlands, the different countries have developed those data. They've produced new methods, they've tested them, they've quality assured them, etc., and then published the results. So that might be on education, employment, etc., etc. So developing individual data sets will be the next step. Then when you're satisfied with the quality of those data, you can then introduce it into the census and maybe use it to replace questions on the census with administrative data. So gradually over time, you can switch in more and more registered-based or administrative-based data. And then when you're able to do that for all of your statistics, either from registers or maybe from surveys, as the Netherlands still does, you're able to then move to a fully register-based census. Now, that kind of process in the Nordic countries started in the 60s and 70s and probably took about 30 years. But developments in IT since then have meant that it's possible to make these changes faster than was the case in the 60s and 70s. So Austria switched from a traditional census in 2001 to a fully registered-based census in 2011. And they had very strong political support, very strong government support. There was changes in legislation to make this happen, and they had strong public support. So that kind of 10-year change is actually very rapid. So even today, this kind of process, this step-by-step process is going to take time. It will take time to build the systems and build the teams, time to do the quality assurance work, time to set up reporting procedures, which might not work first time. So don't think this is an overnight step. If you decide to go down this road, you're on the start of a journey that's going to take some time. And then my final slide, conclusions. So I think the key message that comes through with all of the countries that have been on this journey is it's important to just start. You won't get it right first time, it won't be perfect, but you will gain experience and you'll learn lessons and you'll learn about the quality of the data from the registers and administrative sources that are available to you. It will take time to put in place the data supply agreements, legislation if you need it, memorandums of understanding, etc. Emphasising this point about taking politicians and the public with you. And it's really important to sell the benefits of this approach, but also to explain the protections that are in place, the security and the privacy protections. Business registers are likely to be in place already in many countries, so therefore focus on the address register, which can also support your traditional censuses in the meantime, and a population register. And then develop the other data sources depending on the relative priority, what high value administrative data is available within your country that you could start to develop. So that's all I have to say. It's a bit of a run through and there's plenty of time now for questions. Thank you.
Hi Ian, there is a question from Jacob in the chat. The question is, addresses are critical in the move towards linkages of systems. Usually in developing countries, NSOs compile addresses for censuses, which is not necessarily the same as the CR agencies. What's your advice to countries to prepare today for future linkages of systems for statistical purposes?
That's an excellent question. So in some countries, the mapping agency, for instance, might have an address register and the postal provider, but that wasn't the case in Canada, for instance. So Statistics Canada, over the last few censuses, probably the last 15, 20 years, has developed its own statistical address register. So they started with information from the census, from I think it might have been the 2001 census. They have a 5-yearly census. They started with that address information, and then they added in information from the postal provider. They added in information from electricity companies, or meters, addresses for meters and water, etc., etc. So I think the running of the census, and particularly these days, if you're doing face-to-face interviews and people have devices, mobile devices, you have an ideal opportunity to capture that address information and to capture a geo-reference. So Spain, in their combined census in 2011, part of that they did, the first part of that was actually just creating an address register for the country. And then they had their census. So and that was part of the census process. So the census operation, when you're going out to addresses, particularly with an interview-based census, as I believe happens in the Pacific, that's an ideal opportunity to start to create an address register. Are there any more questions?
Yes, I have a question. This is Nimo Mo from SDS, Samuel. I'm interested, thank you very much for the questions. I just wanted to follow, sorry I missed out some of the presentation in the beginning, but I wanted to go back to the population register. I'm interested to know what variables are you referring to when you say population register? Is this a combination of all the other registers that you have mentioned, like employment register, business register, or are there specific variables in this national population register?
Yeah, so in countries where you don't have a national identification system, so you're having to produce a statistical estimate of the population, and so that's true in Canada, New Zealand and the UK. I can tell you what the UK did, and we'll hear more about this in, I think it's webinar 5, but I can tell you now because the team that did this used to work for me. So we took the registers that had the best coverage. So this was a register from our benefits agency that included people on working benefits, in-work benefits, pensions, etc. So that had very good coverage of young people who got child benefit and older people who had pensions. Then we also took information from our tax authority of people that were in work, and that covered the middle ages quite well. There were some issues with the self-employed because they weren't necessarily in that register, or they were there but with quite a long delay. So those were the two main ones, and then we also added in information from our health service provider, the National Health Service. The problem with that one is that they have what they call list inflation. So there are about 10 million people more on that list than there are in the country. So people registered with one doctor and then they move and they don't get deregistered and they appear twice, or they leave the country and they don't deregister. So those were the three main sources that we linked together. And then we came up with various rules on to determine for an individual, did we think they existed, and if so, where? So if they appeared in three of the registers all at the same place, that was a very high quality linkage. If they only appeared in one, that was a kind of lower quality linkage, and we took a kind of probabilistic approach to start with, so we would kind of give them half a weight, but they stayed in the list. And then what we did was we produced we started to produce population estimates based on that, and then we compared. We had this data from our last census, which was in 2011. So we compared that data against the 2011 census, and we found out, for instance, we were missing lots of children that were aged 0 to 4. because they weren't on some of these other sources. So then we looked at the civil registration data and added in birth data, etc. So there was that kind of gradual process of refining that population register, comparing it back against the census, working out what might have gone wrong. And in the end, we came up with what we call essentially what we called a statistical population register. Does that? There's a long answer to that question. Does that help?
So my understanding is that the population register is a combination of all the other separate registers. Is that right?
No, not all of them. So this is we're calling it, the UK is called a statistical population register to differentiate it from those countries where you have a national ID scheme, you'll have a national population register. So I'm talking here about countries that don't have that kind of scheme, so a statistical population register. It used a small number of registers that had the most coverage. So, as I said, the benefits and tax and health were the ones that had the highest coverage in the UK. And I imagine that's probably true in most countries.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I think just to add on to that conversation is in the next webinar we'll be covering a bit about population registers and their structure and the kind of variables, basically referring to your question some more. And so I hope we will have a better session to engage about how it looks like for different countries and different circumstances. That's what I would add to that conversation. But as a quick reference, I would refer you to the UN Legal Identity Agenda has a graphic that I've been trying to look out for, but I've not been able to get it at the moment, which really just shows the relationships between different platforms, between the civil registration platform, the population register, and the other databases that the population register could be linking data from. Personally, I believe for countries that do not have one, it is a gradual process. You would start off with your civil registration database and combining that with the migration database, and from there you at least get a way that you can derive your population counts per se, and then that can proceed to link up to other registers that are mature enough to be connected to the register. But I believe we will have a session to talk about it more during the next webinar.
And Ian, there's a question on from Elizabeth asking for remote local population estimates, would voter or electoral registrations be useful?
So this is where you've got people living maybe on islands that are a long way away. Is that the kind of context we're talking about?
Yes. Yes. So these would. Yes.
So was that voter and electoral? What was the other one? I can't see the question.
Sorry, Ian, can you say that again?
So I'll just repeat.
Yeah, Michael, if you could just repeat the question.
So for remote local population estimates, would voter registrations be useful? So I think Elizabeth, feel free to jump on the call, but I think she might be asking if you wanted to do like nationally disaggregated estimates, do electoral rolls play a role?
So I don't know about the situation in your countries. In the UK, for instance, voter registration isn't a legal requirement and voting isn't a legal requirement. So our electoral roll is not complete, and obviously it only covers adults. You can use it for, obviously addresses for where you've got them. If you're sending out voter information. So I think it sounds like it's a source that's well worth exploring, but you would have to actually look at the quality of your data and the coverage within your individual situation. but it would certainly be useful information in the absence of anything else.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ian. And there's Melly's got a question for Stats Netherlands. So the question is, I am very interested with regard to them changing their Statistics Act to assess other stakeholders' data. How did they go about changing the Act, and how did it come out in the end?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a good point. We used to have a Statistics Act without that information, but we felt after the 2001 census that it would be better to be sure that we would get the data. So we had an interest in being sure that we would get the data from other government departments. But it was kind of a deal because the ministry responsible for Statistics Netherlands, so we are on their payroll, said, well, we are willing to help you changing the Statistics Act, knowing that we could work more efficiently and cheaper. So it was also in the interest of the country that the other government authorities would make the data available for us. So the ministry helped us a lot in redrafting the Statistics Act, and the minister also went to Parliament to defend these points. And so there was something in it for all, for us to get the data, for the ministry to get a more efficient and cheaper office. And this new act is effective since 2004. So in our last census, we were sure that we would get the data. I mean, you can say, well, keep your fingers crossed, but that's not a very reliable strategy. So now we know that in the end we will get the data. It gives us a better legal position to start with.
Thank you, Meli. Does that answer your question, Meli? Thank you, Eric.
Yes, thank you, Gloria. You did. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think with that, if we don't have any other comments, but we still, do we have?
I do have a comment, thanks. So this is Mike from SPC, and yeah, I think the legislative review is a really essential step, and I think even beyond population and administrative data sources, legislative review is necessary in the Pacific generally. I look at the perspective. I look at the issue from the perspective of microdata access, and the fact that a lot of national statistical agencies do not have clear statistics acts that designate responsibility and discretion of the government statistician to disseminate development microdata. So that's one angle in terms of microdata, and I think that the need for legislative review and update to statistics acts is emphasised by the microdata issue and now the issue that we're talking about in terms of administrative and population-based register data. So I view that legislative review is really an essential first point of action to start to exploit opportunities to start to integrate administrative data into national statistical systems. And it's my view that the legislation should give authority to statistical agencies to collect and compile administrative data from line ministries, NGOs and others, for example. And yes, I think that, we haven't heard from Paris 21 today, which is unfortunate, but a really great facilitating tool to go along with legislative review is the implementation and strong political support for a national statistical development strategy. And if that strategy outlines these data sharing arrangements between line ministries and the National Statistical Agency, then all the better to complement a strong Statistics Act that empowers the government statistician to start to collate national data. And just to finish there, I can see there's some more questions coming in. So there's one from Ben. I believe Ben is in Samoa. Sorry, I can't see your last name, Ben. So his question is, I can see one essential component of the NPR is address registers. In many Pacific countries, it is small or non-existent. Which ministry should be taking the lead in this? And I feel that NSOs and CRs are users rather than producers of address registers. There's also a follow-up question from Tracy Savage at Stats New Zealand, and her question is, I'd like to contribute a couple of quick comments from Stats New Zealand if there's time. Oh, okay. So perhaps we can address Ben's question on who should be responsible for address registers, the maintenance of them, the establishment of them, and then we can hand over to Tracy.
I'll start, and Eric might have some views on this as well. I mean, in a UK context, we wanted somebody else, one of the government departments, to produce an address register. The thing is, when you're producing an address register for statistical purposes and for census, it's actually a bit different from if you're just posting mail or something like that. So you have to be able to identify the individual living unit within a property. You know, it may have been subdivided or something. So for delivering mail, you have one letterbox, and that's all the postal provider cares about. But obviously within a census, you care about the 4 flats that are now inside that building. So the needs of a statistical organisation for producing census results are actually quite different and quite high, actually. You need to have high quality classification of properties between business and residential, etc., and know about subdivisions, etc. The idea, the concept that household follows the kind of census concept of a household. So in a UK context, we wanted somebody else to do that, but for the 2011 census, we couldn't agree that, and the ONS ended up having to produce a statistical register for its own purposes. As I said earlier, Stats New Zealand has produced its own statistical address register for statistical purposes. So I think if you have another department or agency that's able and willing to do this, I think that's probably the best solution. But if you don't, then I think the NSO has to do it for itself. I don't know, what's the situation in the Netherlands, Eric?
Yeah, we do have a register on addresses and buildings that has improved over time, because it's not an easy register to set up. But we use it also for many statistics, including our census. And we can link it to the people, so we know who lives where. And so we also know who lives at the same address. And that's important for defining the households. So this is what we call one of our base registers. We have a number of key registers, and this is one of them. It's a very essential part, because if you only have the people, you don't know enough. You don't want to know who lives where, and you want the registers to be linkable. And well, this was a process over time, and we are very, very fortunate that we have these registers available now. That makes the life for our census team much easier. That's for sure.
Can I make a comment? Can you hear me, Gloria?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Just overall comments. I think I would like to support what Mike has said about legislative review. But we must also bear in mind that when you're doing that review, you need to also consider the legislation of other ministries, because we also have difficulties trying to access micro data from other ministries because they have their own confidentiality data. So it's not just a review on the side of the statistics, but also we need to reach out to other legislation, which is having a barrier between NSO and access to other assets. So that's my comments on the legislation. And I think I would like to appreciate the experience from Netherlands when they said that they had lots of meetings and discussions with the owners of data. I think that's the side we're also taking. I mean, we are very much engaged with our users, and we really believe in working together with your stakeholders and the data owners. In that way, the legislation will be a secondary to first, if you have that understanding between your ministries, then legislation will not be a problem. But to us, legislation is the last resort. But we need to fix the relationship between us as NSOs and also our other registers. So as long as we have that good relationship, we understand what we are sharing, then I think it will be very, data sharing will be very easy. And then going back to the national ID identification, I think it was, we see that the development of actually getting into where you are right now, it took many years. It's not just an overnight shift. So I think for us in the Pacific, we also have a long way to go, and that's where I appreciate what Ian has said, that it's time that we start doing something. I think we're already moving on, but we need to see the progress of how we're doing it as we move forward, because not all of us are in the same state. Some are more faster than others, so there's a long way for us in the Pacific to move into a fully registered census. In terms of, I'm not sure how these population registers can actually monitor population growth when using fertility, the birth rates and death rates, whether you are also basing those estimates from the register, civil registration. So maybe on that side, it will be, and also the migration side of it, when you monitor the population growth. For changes annually, I think I'm just worried about people who are not coming forward to register. I mean, how do we know for sure that this is everybody? This is the total employed population, this is the total population needing health, this is the total population needing education. How do we know? I mean, that's where the population census comes in, because it really helps us to identify key areas where there is less response and areas where there's more response. I think I'm talking from experience from a small country, but I think this will be a very different context compared to our Europe countries. So, but thank you very much for sharing, and that's all I can share for now.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Fono. I would like to hand the floor over to Tracy to make some comments.
Morning. It's Tracy Savage from Stats NZ here. Picking up on Malefono's comments just then, and also what Ian said earlier, I just wanted to share a little bit about Stats NZ's experience, but also to note that there'll be a fuller presentation from a colleague of mine, Christine Bycroft from Stats NZ, at a future webinar. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I just wanted to reiterate the idea of, if you haven't already, of making a start. So at Stats NZ, we started looking at an admin data-based census option back in 2012 in our census transformation program, and that's still going. And yeah, we've learned heaps along the way. I guess a couple of points to note is you don't have to go all of the way, so making the start that Ian's outlined can be useful in many different ways for your census, even if you haven't or don't want to progress as far as a register-based census. So that was one point, and the other point was, yeah, it takes time. We've been working on it 8 years and there's still more to do, but it's also a really good risk management strategy. I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but we hit a large non-response issue with our 2018 census, and we hadn't run a register-based census or an admin-based census. It was a more traditional census, but because we'd started looking at all of that admin data and whether it could be useful in a census, it meant that as part of our response, we were able to improve the data quality by using administrative data. So yeah, you don't have to go all the way to a register, but making a start, if you haven't already, is really important, and yet can be a useful risk mitigation strategy. In our scenario, it was non-response due to non-participation, but it could be because of a natural disaster or many other reasons. So yeah, that was all I wanted to contribute. Thank you.
Okay, there's one more question from Ben, which is, so we treat NPR as a de jure type of count. Eric or Ian, do you have any comments about NPR, whether it's treated as a de jure type of count?
Do you want to start, Eric?
Yeah, that's fine. That's correct. We consider our population register as the backbone of our census, and this is a de jure census. You count everybody that is registered, so you count all the legal people, which is most of the people in the country. It's not everybody. In the very, very old days, we had a de facto census, but it's a very long time ago that we moved towards the population register as the basis. So that was actually in the 1850s, so that's a very, very long time ago, before we had the de facto census, and since then we have always had the de jure census. And all our virtual censuses we had in more recent years are de jure censuses.
The same is true in the UK. Our traditional census is a de jure or a usual residence census. And if you're moving over to using administrative data, you have to move to a de jure or a usual residence-based census because you can't be sure where people were on census night. Now, I know some countries, Statistics New Zealand still has a de facto census, so that population base is something you need to think about. But yeah, moving towards use of administrative and registered data almost by definition means that you're moving to a de jure or a usual residence census.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for a very engaging conversation. I think I'll hand it over to Eric and Ian to give any final remarks as the presenters for the session.
I don't have anything more to add.
Well, I just want to say it was a pleasure for me to give this presentation to all these people of all these countries. I'm also very pleased with all the questions and discussions because I think that's really interesting to discuss with each other what you are doing in the different countries and what you can learn from each other. I also learned a lot myself by listening to the questions and thinking about good answers. I can imagine that even later on people may have questions. So if they want to contact me, that's always fine. And if you look on my slides, also there's my email address. I do read my emails every day, but normally at different times from today, because now here it's in the middle of the night, so it's very dark here. But you're always welcome to ask me questions. So I hope we can continue the discussions later on by mail. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Any comments from countries?
We just want to thank the presenters for sharing their experience to us. It was very interesting, and I think we've already made a little start, and we hope to make it bigger next time. So thank you very much for joining us.
Right. Thank you very much for joining. We will have a roundtable session. I think we'll send out an invitation on the 20th where we'll talk about ID systems between Pacific delegates. And then our next webinar, the third webinar, we'll be hearing from Indonesia about their combined census, and then we'll also hear about population registers, and then we'll get a more in-depth into the prerequisites, advantages and disadvantages of register-based censuses. So that is on the 20th of August, but that is on the 26th of August, but we are also inviting you for a roundtable session to discuss about ID systems on the 20th, and we'll send out a formal invitation to that effect. I just want to thank you very much for taking your time to join us today. Thank you, Ian and Eric. I know it's very late on your side. We will allow you to go and sleep now, but we really appreciate your contribution to this session today. Thank you, colleagues, and until next time, goodbye.